Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Bill Donahue, and I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. These events, before we get started, I wanted to say these events don't get planned by themselves. We have a great staff at the Nanovic, and apart from the usual culprits, and you can tell I'm new because I'm still looking at my notes, Sharon, Chris, Anthony, Jen, and Mark, I want to thank in particular Melanie Webb and Monica Caro because they really worked hard on this event, so thank you so much. Maybe we could applaud them for that. Also, before we begin, I want to welcome two new scholars and residents at the Institute. I'm not going to get their names precisely right, but I'm going to ask you to forgive me in advance. Dr. Olev Turich is the acting director of the Institute of Church History and vice rector for external affairs at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lvov, Ukraine. Would you please stand? Dr. Bartosz Jóźwik is the acting chairman of the Department of International Economic Relations at the John Paul II Catholic University in Lublin, Poland. Welcome. Olev and Bartosz will be with us for the entire semester, so if you would like to meet with them, talk with them, set up a lunch, invite them to your classes, we would love that. We really want to exploit them fully. Now, I mean it. How wonderful it is to come together this afternoon in the Elizabeth Nanovic Seminar Room, nested so cozily within the grandiose Nanovic Hall, right next to the Nanovic Institute. What would make this list of Nanovics complete? Well, Bob and Liz sitting with us this afternoon, and indeed they are, so we're glad that you're here. I thank you, Bob and Liz, from my heart for bringing Europe to the great Midwest with this wonderful building, this institute, these visiting scholars, and everything else you do. You bring European culture to the prairie. And all joking aside, we are deeply grateful for it. There is arguably nothing that has spread the renown of this great institute more than the Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies, which we bestow this afternoon upon Professor Thomas W. Laqueur for his magnificent study, The Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains. The Shannon Prize, if I can remind you, is awarded annually to the author of the best book in European studies that transcends a focus on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about contemporary Europe as a whole. I happen to come to this book from two perspectives. First, I was privileged to serve as one of the final jurors who had the task of determining the recipient of this year's $10,000 prize. Did we tell you about the $10,000? I'm not so sure. Allow me to remind you of the jury's citation, which reads, only in part, quote, "No culture has been indifferent to mortal remains. Even in our supposedly disenchanted scientific age, the dead body still matters for individuals, communities, and nations. A remarkably ambitious history, The Work of the Dead offers a compelling and richly detailed account of how and why the living have cared for the dead from antiquity to the 20th century. Now, it may well be correct that no true culture is indifferent to mortal remains. But I come to this book also as a scholar of the Holocaust, and therefore as someone to whom it is particularly clear that for too many, there are no graves, and in most cases, no recoverable remains. I had the privilege to interview a number of Holocaust survivors for the Holocaust Foundation, and one of their chief laments, again and again, was the lack of a proper gravesite, of a ritual place to mourn their dead. Their loved ones had largely and literally gone up in smoke. But the Holocaust, an apparent limit case to Thomas Laqueur's thesis, ultimately makes his point. For you might think there would be no cultural work for these dead to perform. But you would be wrong. As Thomas Laqueur shows in his moving description of the lengths to which we go to preserve and honor the faintest of human remains. It is for me a particularly poignant part of a book full of access points for readers with a variety of backgrounds, specialties, no specialty at all, and a variety of interests. And it is a book that is genuinely, and I want to say this to anyone who hasn't read it yet, genuinely a treat to read, because Laqueur is one of the few academics who is a real stylist. Now, after all of that, you might expect me to hand over the prize, but not so quick. Apparently, there's a custom that the recipient first must give a lecture. And if we like the lecture, we'll vote again, and we'll see. No. Anyway, so now allow me to give the podium to the Helen Fawcett Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Thomas Laqueur, who will present a lecture entitled Bodies Visible and Invisible, Nationalism and the Necro-Politics of the Jewish Cemetery in Modern Thessaloniki. Professor Laqueur.
Well, I'd like to just put Ibid to his thank yous, but I do want to thank Monica and Melanie for making this, arranging lots of things and making the visit possible. It is a tremendous honor. When I look at the people who've won this award, it's humbling. My honored teacher, Jerry Siegel, and Christopher Clark, and Tara Zara, and Michael Mong, it really is, it's a list. And so it means a lot to me to be added to that list. So I want to talk to you, as I say today, about bodies visible and invisible in Thessaloniki. It deals with the themes of this book, but we don't actually deal with this subject in the book itself. But the talk then is about dead bodies, and it's about dead bodies at the juncture of three political stories. One is the story of the Holocaust in Greece. The second is the story of urban renewal and the transformation of an Oriental city into a modern Western one. And the third is the creation of the national Greek state through the erasure of memory. That is, through making the claim by this erasure of bodies that there have always been Greeks and only Greeks in the northern province of Thessaloniki, which is not the case. So let me just say a little bit about the background of this talk. It began in thinking about this in 2002, when Carla Hesse, my colleague and wife and historian, and I were in Thessaloniki for a conference at the Aristotle University on the cultural history of the body. Carla's mother was a child of the region's Jewish diaspora. Her Carla's grandfather was from Monastir, which is now in Albania, and her mother's from Kastoria, which is a couple hours drive from Thessaloniki, but still in Greece. And Carla's mom had given us a small sort of, not mimeograph, but a very modest handbook that was produced by the American Sephardi organization. And we arrived jet-lagged, and we picked up the book and started to read as we settled into our hotel. And we read that on the land of the university, which was visible from our balcony, there had once been a vast Jewish cemetery, really vast. In fact, something on the order of 350,000 to 500,000 square hectares. The actual space is still in dispute because they're now building near the university, and they're finding bones, and there's a major controversy about what exactly the bounds of this cemetery were. But you may have 35 to 50 hectares is big. Probably the biggest cemetery, as I say, the biggest cemetery in the world. So the next day I went to give my talk in the old philosophy building, which is at the end of the campus, first building on campus. I'll have to come to that. You'll see that in a moment. And we walked around, and there was no trace of this cemetery. As in, no trace. There was no plaque, no memorial, certainly no gravestones, nothing to suggest that 500,000 bodies lay beneath the university's surface, where 665,000 students and their professors were now going about their academic business. So when I started my talk, which was on the body, some aspect of the body in the 18th century, I mentioned this fact, that we were speaking on 500,000 unidentified, forgotten, erased bodies. None of our cosmopolitan and highly educated Greek colleagues who had introduced me knew anything about this. Many of them were natives at Thessaloniki. Also remarkable. So these were people educated in Cambridge and Oxford. These were not provincials. These were people of the world who'd lived there all their lives, progressive, didn't have a particular reason to forget. They just didn't know about it. So at their encouragement, we wrote a short version of the talk I'm going to give today. I've done much more research since, and it was published in Greek translation in a Greek feminist journal called Dini in 2004. And there was also an unpublished English version of this, which sort of had an underground Samistat-like existence among members of the Thessaloniki Jewish community, also among the political community generally. We subsequently learned that the mayor who organized the memorial I'm about to tell you about had read our paper, and it's also cited by various scholars. So the Samistat version had a history. It'll appear very soon in a volume on the Cambridge's publishing on the Holocaust in Greece. So this paper is sort of grown out of this trying to say something to the Greeks that we thought was of some importance, and I think is of general importance in European history. So in 2014, this era of forgetting ended. And for the first time, visitors of the university were alerted to this destroyed city of the dead underfoot. Interpretive signs, which you see there on the right side of the picture, in 4 languages read, the Nazis wanted to erase any trace of the Jewish presence in the city. To that end, the destruction of the Jewish cemetery began in December 1942, a place of sacred memory. It was, the sign goes on to say, the work of the Nazi occupation forces and their collaborators. This isn't the case. Neither here nor elsewhere in Europe were the Nazis particularly interested in erasing all cultural traces of the people they were in fact trying to annihilate. And cemetery desecration was at worst an occasional sideline of Nazi activities. The cemetery was destroyed entirely by Greek workmen at the command of an ultra-nationalist city council. But before telling the story of what actually happened and why it was so long forgotten, I want to begin with 2 general observations and 1 particular observation. First, the erasure of the old Jewish cemetery, that is to say, its complete physical and until very recently symbolic erasure from the city, is unusual enough to demand an explanation. That is, cemetery destruction on this scale in the modern world, like iconoclasm in the Reformation and in other periods of religious turmoil, is sort of the nuclear war of cultural politics. It's rare. The only comparable case was in the Yemeni civil war some years ago, on a much smaller scale. So this is really an almost unique level of the destruction of the place of the dead in European history. The second general observation is that the absence of the living doesn't make the erasure of the dead a foregone conclusion. So you might argue that since the Jews were gone from Thessaloniki, that is to say 94% of the community, roughly speaking, were murdered, the remains of their ancestors would become culturally meaningless. That is to say, their cemetery would be but a fleeting shadow cast by a void. But places of the dead are never, it seems to me, demographically precise correlative of worlds of the living. They exist everywhere in a kind of tenuous balance between the actual social world and an imagined one. So all the major Jewish cemeteries of Europe from before the Holocaust survive as memorial to communities that once buried their dead there, even though these communities are now tiny. Finally, I want to be more precise in formulating the question, because the answer to the first part of the question, how did the cemetery meet its fate, has never been in doubt. The history of the Jewish cemetery in Thessaloniki was known and remembered within the Jewish community, or I should say those who chose to remember it, because Rabbi Michael Molho, very distinguished Sephardi family in Greece, who escaped deportation, got to the Argentine, and bore witness to what he had observed firsthand that December. And also because of the history of the Jewish community written by Yosef Nehama, who was principal of the Alliance Israelite and a leading figure of the community, also wrote about it. He actually didn't, he was taken to the camps and survived and subsequently wrote a history of this. So these are in French, and they're available to everyone to read. Various Greek scholars have also told parts of the story and a number of local histories, but still, it's an unassimilated history. So when Carl and I asked the question again, both as an exercise in recovery and also as a question of interpretation, why is it that something that had never been really lost needs to be recovered? So by the 20th century, the cemetery had existed in some form for almost 2 millennia. So you want to remember that Paul preached to the Jews of Thessaloniki. It grew exponentially over the centuries as the burial place of the descendants of the Iberian Jews who fled eastward into the Mediterranean after the Christian reconquest of Spain in 1492. These were the Sephardim, and also a smaller number of Ashkenazi Jews who later on fled from the pogroms of the Russian Empire. By the 19th century, it covered, as I stated, between 35 and 50 hectares, and was the ancient city's most extant place of the dead. So when I'm talking about the urban renewal issue, I won't have the slide up, but I'd like you just to think about this. This cemetery is, see the cemetery is really up there? There's a smaller Turkey cemetery down there, there's a Domi cemetery here, but basically it cuts the city in half. So if you're an urban planner, you've got to do something about putting these two parts of the city together. And I'll get to that version of the story. So it really is big, and this is imposed on the university now. So it's really a big part. It's a big part of the city. So in a small, modest way, its demise, and more specifically its assimilation into the city, began under the Ottoman government already in 1890, when a small swath of it was used to build an avenue to the over to there, in the far end, build an avenue in the city, and a palace that, after the Ottomans, became the old philosophy building. In 1917, a fire destroyed much of the old Oriental Salonika and accelerated the process of urban renewal. And part of the plans of modernization was to build a larger space for the university and a vast municipal park, which was going to be at the expense in some level of the Jewish cemetery and of the other cemeteries as well. So the cemeteries were to be preserved, but other modern functions were to be put in their place. So details varied, but in general, Thessaloniki, as it now was called, and as it had been known in antiquity, was in that regard no different from any other European city, which was going to convert old cemeteries to new uses. For the next 20 years, the Jewish community negotiated with the city council about its land. There seemed no practical urgency. I mean, there were lots of small controversies, but no big urgency. The university took very little land, and the Jews, fewer than there'd been before, because when many left after the creation of the Greek nation and the rise of nationalism, continued burying their dead as they'd always done. Then the Wehrmacht arrives on April 9, 1941, and that upsets this 20 or 30-year period of a sort of desultory equilibrium. Less than a year later, on December 6, 42, representatives and experts of the Jewish community met at the cemetery site with city architects and with civilian representatives of the German occupation forces. An agreement had been reached that gave the city and the university more land than they had reached in an earlier agreement in 1937. I'm not taking you through each of these little negotiations, but in any case, and provided, or at least so the Jewish leadership thought, for an orderly removal of tombs, especially tombs of historical interest, for the safety of the graves of those who've been buried in the last 30 years, and for some sort of appropriate planting. alternative burial sites were to be provided. It didn't happen that way. No sooner was the meeting over when 500 Greek workmen in the pay of the municipality began to lay waste to the entire site with axes and sledgehammers and set the stage for its erasure. A few stones, those whose owners managed to remove them before the impending destruction, made their way to the much smaller Jewish cemetery. Some migrated to the American Farm School, and others made their way into the fabric of the city. So this is what it looked like before. It wasn't a beautiful cemetery as they reached, it was just vast. Eastern Jews didn't, it sort of looked like someone said like a great collection of beehives. But you can imagine, if you look at this picture, you know, it goes up in the hill and slowing all the way down, which is where Paul preached, all the way down to the sea. And then, this is what it looks like. So the director of antiquities appropriated the stones he thought of special archaeological interest, and the rest were incorporated with sort of unseemly haste into various Greek building projects, as if the dead they had guarded belonged to some ancient, long since disappeared civilization that could be plundered at will. 6 months after the deportations of the Jews to Auschwitz began, the great church of St. Demetrius got 500 marble slabs and 200 bricks that they used to make repairs from damage that had been done earlier, and many other parishes were on the take as well. And there were plenty of secular scavengers. Tombstones were used to pave the sidewalk along Strada's Avenue, which is the main street in Thessaloniki, the square in front of the National Theater, build toilets at a school, build a chapel at a nearby Christian cemetery. The Aristotle University Professors Association decorated the church at their summer housing cooperative with fragments of Jewish cemetery tombstones. Intact slabs were used in the dissection tables in the medical school, and fragments of the stones that were completely destroyed were used as rubble. Some extended the beach. Some created an artificial hill for a new royal palace. Some went into the service of occupation forces. As Rabbi Molo points out, some large stones went into the construction of a Wehrmacht swimming pool. Pillaging continued through the war and after the war. So the dead and their names in stone were not so much forgotten, although that too, as built into the fabric of a world that had rejected them. Stones stripped of their history and their meaning. We're dealing here not with the looting of a Jewish cemetery by impoverished villagers. There's a fair amount of that in small cemeteries in Poland and the Ukraine and parts of Eastern Europe, but of the systematic destruction and erasure of the world of the Jewish dead that had been part of Thessaloniki for time out of mind, for millennia. When the last traces of the Jewish cemetery disappeared, we don't know. But well-educated teenage girls on an excursion from a nearby high school played at Hamlet with Jewish skulls and leg bones that must still have been strewn around in the late 1960s or early 70s. Their pretend games were not as yet an embarrassment in 1997 when this picture that I'm showing you here was published in a yearbook. So it's kind of amazing. I mean, it's a remarkable. These are, in other words, there's one thing for, it's probably not so great for boys to play with what they found in Indian burial mounds, but you can at least imagine this is long gone to different people. This is in the generation of their parents, or even their generation. So, as I said, I don't know when one could see nothing anymore, which we were there in 2004, nothing was available. But still, in the 70s, you could still see this. Okay, so that's what happened. Let me now put this in the context of three stories. The first one is the story of the Holocaust, and that's the most obvious explanation for the destruction of the cemetery. It's part of the Holocaust in Greece, and that's what the sign on the site says. The account offered on the memorial site today says the Germans did it, and presumably as part of their war on the Jews. By omission, the authoritative United States Holocaust Memorial Museum implies the same thing.
Its webpage on Thessaloniki opens with a picture of the destroyed cemetery with the following citation: "View of the destroyed Jewish cemetery in German-occupied Thessaloniki. The tombstones were used for building material." It was also recently the view of the leading Anglophone historian of the period. In December, the Germans began to demolish the great Jewish cemetery, which lay on the eastern side of the city, writes Mark Mazauer in 1993. They didn't, and so much is clear. And Mark Mazauer got it right in 2005. I cited our paper. But it's really amazing that this evident fact, it will become more evident in a moment, was simply not registered. But the question of the relationship of the destruction of the cemetery to the Holocaust is of some interpretive delicacy. It's unquestionable that the Nazi presence in the city made it easier for others to grab land that they had long wanted. More specifically, it placed the status of the cemetery back into play after 30 years of these desultory negotiations. During the summer of 1942, the German occupation forces had conscripted 3,500 men of the Jewish community into backbreaking labor under appalling conditions. That is to say, people were dying in significant numbers. Max Merton, who was a civilian head of the economic and administrative department of the German occupation, thought that the mortality rate was something on the order of 12% or more. 12% is what Molo estimated. Merton thought higher. So the Jewish community was desperate, and in October, he and Merton and the leaders of the Jewish community met and negotiated a sum of money to be paid by the Jewish community that would be used to hire substitute Greek workers. That is to say, a ransom. 3.5 billion drachmas. 2 billion were in cash, and the rest, 1.5 billion, were in kind. That is to say, the land of the Jewish cemetery. Many members of the Jewish community rejected the deal, but there was little to be done in the context of the unbearable psychological, economic, and cultural pressures from Nazi anti-Semitic legislation and from a hostile local administration. The men were released. All through October and November, the German authorities made clear that they intended to follow through on the bargain and to take the cemetery, although how quickly they were going to take the cemetery wasn't clear. They had no particular use for it. In December, on December 6th, the day this destruction happened, Merton met with members of the Jewish community and the Governor General of Thessaloniki at the cemetery and reopened the negotiations about how the ransom would be paid. He decided to give the university a relatively small amount of the land beyond what had already been transferred in 1937, and the rest would stay as it was for the time being. And we have evidence. This is not just his later testimony. We have written evidence for that being the case. And then he left. No sooner did he go than these Greek workmen hired by the city moved in and began to destroy the ancient cemetery wholesale. The final blow fell so fast that the community was essentially helpless. The work of destroying the cemetery was done in such haste that very few Jews succeeded in finding the remains of their families and relatives, wrote the United States consul in Istanbul. Recently buried dead were thrown to the dogs. The work continued for 3 weeks. The deportation of Thessaloniki's Jews to the death camp beginning in March once and for all settled the long and vexed question of the cemetery ownership. By order of the Finance Ministry on October 14, 1943, the entire cemetery was considered forfeit on the grounds that it had been deserted by its owners. And that would be the legal basis for municipal and other claims on the tombstones for the building purposes that I've already told you about. So yes, the destruction of the Jewish cemetery was part of the Holocaust in Greece, broadly understood, even though the Germans actually took no part in it. The fact that the cemetery became an issue again after these sets of sort of negotiations that went nowhere was a result of Nazi occupation labor policy, the conscription of these Greek workers. The German presence made it possible and gave comfort to the Greeks who attacked and destroyed the cemetery. But there's no evidence that Merton or any men under his jurisdiction had anything to do with the final solution to the Jewish cemetery question, or that they saw this as a prelude to the deportation of the Jews, which Eichmann organized shortly thereafter. Merton was, I think, telling the truth when he testified at Eichmann's trial, how he understood the question. His decision was in line with the Greek law of 1936. So that is, while it involved some additional land, it followed more or less the same principles of orderly exhumation and conversion to other uses. The event that led to the destruction then of the cemetery had more to do with German efforts to gain the support of the local regime than with the murder or the eradication of the Jews. Now, of course, the Germans didn't destroy the cemetery themselves. That is to say, Max Merton's last word on the subject was to confiscate parts for these instrumental purpose and leave the rest as it was. Now, the point of why I believe this is that it's more or less in keeping with Nazi policy, or more precisely, the lack of Nazi policy toward Jewish places of the dead. The destruction or even the desecration of Jewish cemeteries during the Holocaust was incidental. There's nothing approaching the scale of what happened in Thessaloniki anywhere else. Yes, of course, the Nazis systematically murdered Jews. The Nazis pillaged their bodies for whatever value they could get and disposed of them as carrion. They had no compunction about desecrating graves on occasion for some particular local instrumental purpose, but they had only a passing and narrowly instrumental interest in the burial places of the ancestors of those that they murdered. In Germany itself, there was some vandalization of Jewish cemeteries as part of Kristallnacht, but generally, though, they fared far better than synagogues in the pre-war pogroms that preceded the actual Holocaust. Nazi iconoclasm was directed at where living Jews prayed, not where their ancestors were buried. When Leo Baeck, the great progressive rabbi, returned to Worms in 1948, he was offended to be offered postcards for sale of the ruined cemetery, but comforted by the cemetery, untainted, stones and candles on the grave left by other Jewish visitors. It seemed, he wrote, to capture the memory of 1,000 years as a beautiful and at the same time defiant picture. So there are, of course, exceptions. The Nazis demolished 2/3 of the tombstone, about 7,000 of them in the old medieval cemetery in Frankfurt, which had started in the 13th century, but had been closed in 1829. But the far larger and grander 19th century Jewish cemetery, and a newer one that had been found in 1929, still in use today, was left untouched. And just to give you a brief account of this, all the major pre-war Jewish cemeteries in German cities and towns, east and west, survived the war, including those at the very heart of the National Socialism in Berlin. This is the Ohlsdorf Jewish Cemetery Hall. This is where my grandfather is buried, and his grave is perfectly intact and orderly. This is the great Jewish cemetery in Berlin at Weissensee, where actually Jews hid during the war. So it would have been a site to actually bomb or destroy, but it's essentially intact. I just show you pictures. These are war graves in Ohlsdorf, war graves in Berlin. So just to tell you, even something that would be politically charged, like the fact that Jewish veterans died in the First World War, was left untouched by the Germans. And the same thing is true of the large Jewish cemeteries in Poland. So the Łódź Cemetery is still intact. Budapest fell apart, but not because of the Nazis. There's a new Jewish cemetery. So this is sort of ruins that one finds in Highgate, for example. So just to give you some sense of what remains there, I'll stop at this picture. So the story's a little. So in Germany, things are more or less intact. In these large cities, they are too. It's a little different in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine because this is where the Holocaust happened. There was no large-scale or systematic destruction of Jewish cemeteries, but a combination of poverty, opportunity, anti-Semitism did lead locals in some places to scavenge burial sites. The Germans used some cemeteries as places for mass murders, less as acts of iconoclasm than for convenience. Minsk is the most infamous example, but that cemetery also survived the war. It was closed in 1951. They were used as a place to inflict suffering In La Bonne, Jews were forced day after day to roll gravestones from one part of the cemetery to the other. But again, that cemetery survived. So all of these then are exceptional cases in which Jewish cemeteries were contingent collateral damage of the Holocaust more generally. The Jewish cemeteries in the capitals and the main cities survive, as do old cemeteries like Prague's famous and much visited cemetery. And as I said, Warsaw Ghetto was annihilated. The cemetery is intact. The Łódź cemetery that I showed you pictures of, the edge of what became this infamous ghetto, and it survives in its magnificence. So, finish this thing and to repeat, the Nazi presence tipped the balance between the Jewish community and Orthodox Greeks in a local struggle over the Jewish cemetery in Thessaloniki. The explanation for its destruction and subsequent erasure from memory has deeper and I think more complex roots. Extensive ruins remained in 1945, or more to the point, after the killings of the Greek Civil War in 1949. Enough remained, we are told, to create a memorial park through which Greeks could have represented a vanished community amongst whom they had once for so long lived. The question is why this didn't happen. And the answer is both more general and more particular. So let me turn now to the urban history part of the explanation. Cemeteries and churchyards have never been permanent resting places for the dead. Over the millennia, they and everything else fall prey to the lone and level sands of time. Les Halles, the main wholesale market in Paris, was built on the ground, as many of you know, of the Cemetery of the Innocents, which was destroyed in 1764. It contained about 2 million-ish bodies. It in turn was replaced by this large underground mall that's there now. So St. Pancras train station, which is where the Eurostar now leaves, in London, and where the railway lines enter from the north, replaced the churchyard of a local parish. But what you'll notice is it was taken apart, but there's a remnant of it there now. Thomas Hardy, before he became a novelist, was an architect and organized the placement of the stones that were moved for putting the railway through. So it's commonplace in urban in the urban life of Europe and of any ancient civilization that the land of the dead is used. In fact, the Salonika Jewish Cemetery itself sits, at least in some part, on the grounds of a Byzantine burial place from before the fall of the city to the Turks in 1453. And people have found recycled gravestones from the 16th century with Greek lettering, with Ladino and also Ladino inscriptions added. In other words, the dead survive in place at the sufferance of the living whom they serve. More specifically, in the modern period, both the creation of new cemeteries and the destruction of old ones grew out of a central tenet of Western urban planning which began in the Enlightenment, which was basically move the dead away from the living and put something useful in their place. Ernest Ebrard, who was the city planner who conceived the modern city of Thessaloniki, he was one of these French colonial planners who went around fixing up cities. So he was in Vietnam, he was in Algeria, he was one of these roving experts on urbanization that went around the Francophone world, or the world wanted to be influenced by France, rebuilding cities. When he conceived of modern Thessaloniki, he thought that in place of the old Oriental one, which was destroyed in a fire in 1917, that he would have to do something about the Jewish cemetery. And he was equally committed to getting rid of other burial places. I mean, it just didn't belong in a modern city. Joseph Nehemiah, whom I mentioned to you, the great historian of the Salonika Sephardim, wrote to the British Jewish deputies in 1931 that he thought the Turkish, Greek, and Jewish cemeteries, which occupy the vast area beyond the White Tower, from the seashore to the hills that surround the city, must be transformed into a great public park. But it's clear that while he understood the project of modern urbanization, he had no inkling of the locally perpetrated iconoclasm that was to come. But even for Ebrard, clear-headed observer wouldn't have predicted that the places of the dead were this vulnerable. Though, as I said, cemeteries were not to be spared in the March of Progress. So there was, all that said about urban renewal and moving, the animus displayed in the destruction that began December 6th is not explicable as an aspect of the dispute about urban planning, something well beyond than the resolution of a long, smoldering conflict about land use. Yom Tov Yakwel, a member of the Jewish community, though he's critical of the Jewish leadership in its relationship with the city, that is, that he felt we should be more accommodating to giving them land in the negotiations that went before, recognized in the behavior of the municipal authorities what was happening. The hurried manner and excessive zeal shown by the Greek authorities make it obvious that it wasn't only out of motives aimed at the city's beautification that they were moved to dismantle the Jewish monuments so quickly. The rapidity and purposefulness with which the vast Jewish cemetery was destroyed, the fact that its bones were left on the ground, that all traces of existence are gone, is as unusual in modern European history as it is in the history of the Holocaust and Holocaust commemoration. So two near contemporary cemetery disputes make this distinction clear. In Rome and in Bratislava, fascist regimes were interested in ridding the landscape of what they called as foreign presence and of using the land of Jewish cemeteries for urban renewal. Yet, in both places, provisions were made either for the orderly removal of graves or for monuments. So in Bratislava, you see here, this was the Jewish cemetery in Bratislava. They built a retaining wall around the graves of a dozen famous rabbis, and then they built, after the war, a bridge over this and a place to keep it. So no question that the regime was fascist and anti-Semitic, but the erasure was not, and the same thing is the case in Rome. So the events of December 1942 in Thessaloniki were meant to be acts of iconoclasm, that is to say, the violent destruction of a site sacred to someone else, and not just a dispute over land use gone wrong, or the more or less orderly appropriation of burial land for other purposes. In general, the removal of the dead as a consequence of urban growth and Enlightenment city planning has been an orderly process. In Thessaloniki, for example, the Orthodox Christian cemetery to the northwest, if you might remember this from the picture I showed you, like in so many other European burial grounds, was reduced but not eradicated. And the story is similar somewhere else. If you visit London, Bunhill Fields in the middle of the financial district of London, which was once the great dissenting burial ground, John Bunyan and Daniel Defoe and the great members of the dissenting non-Anglican communities there are buried there, became a park in 1867. And after the war, when it was damaged by German bombs, it was rebuilt as a cemetery site. It's a memorial site to the existence of this community. There's even a campus in England built on a cemetery. That's Leeds, which when Woodhouse Cemetery in Leeds went bankrupt in the 1960s, the university acquired the land. It rehabilitated the chapel, it removed some of the tombstones, it kept others, and it left the bodies in the ground. But basically, you see, there's no question, no one wants to destroy it. The university was built around this site, so you have medical students walking along the gravestones. And I just want to show you another version of this, how this changes the politics of urban renewal. They were digging up in 10th Avenue, a slave cemetery, and the bones got piled up, and then I assume put in the trash. You do the same sort of thing under different political circumstances. This memorial at the Calvary Cemetery in Wall Street, hundreds of millions were spent on preserving this land and then putting up the memorial. This is a big skyscraper could fit on this, right? So this is really valuable land. So my point in all this is to say to you, yes, of course, it's part of urban renewal, but it doesn't follow from the forgetting or not forgetting, the incorporation or not forgetting. Is a story of political memory. So that's the urban renewal part. So let me now talk about finish with the nationalism part. The presence of the Germans in Thessaloniki enabled the city's cemetery's destruction. A long history of land disputes and urban renewal offers the context, but the violence of the attack speaks to the third of the stories that I want to talk to you about, the willful undoing or expunging of the past in the interests of a particular nationalist future. If, as I suggested earlier, the places of the dead represent the social imaginary of the living, which is my explanation for why cemeteries remained in Berlin and these places, because people wanted to remember that another community once lived amongst them. The same. It also works in the other way around. And that, if this is the case, then October 26th to November 8, 1912, which is the liberation of what was then known as Salonika during the First Balkan Wars, and the incorporation of the city into Greece in 1913 and the Treaty of Bucharest, which ended the Second Balkan War, is the starting point for what ultimately happened in 1942, and more significantly for the erasure until very recently of that day and the weeks that followed from national and local memory. In other words, I want to suggest that the nationalist project, which began with the incorporation of Greece, is central to this question of both destruction and forgetting. Thessaloniki, we need to remember, was the predominantly Jewish cities during the years when the Jewish dead occupied so much land at its center. Reliable statistics are hard to come by, but roughly speaking, on the eve of the incorporation of the city into Greece, that is of 1911, the number of Jews was roughly equal to the number of Greeks and Turks combined. 65,000 Jews, 35,000 Greeks, 30,000 Turks, give or take. In 1928, the Turks were almost gone, as were the Domne, this heretical Muslim group. The number of Jews declined by perhaps as much as 20% through immigration, but now lots of Greeks from Macedonia, Albania, moved into the northern provinces. There were now 180,000 Greeks, probably 70 to 80% of the population. So the hard facts of demography and of national incorporation were then mirrored in culture. So elementary education in Greek became compulsory, replacing for many Jews what had been education in French, sponsored by the Alliance Israélite and other organizations. And of course, there were other adjustments. So debates in the early 1920s over whether Sunday should be the only day of rest, a measure that was meant to disadvantage Jews who would have to close on the Sabbath as well as on Sunday, that ended in a compromise. But in any case, the cultural landscape changed for good with the creation of this new national state. And so did politics. Day-to-day pressures of poverty and pressure on resources led to increased friction between the Jewish and the Greek, especially the Greek immigrant community. On the political side, on the political level, these pressures and ethnic national ideology led to the formation of a small, roughly 3,000 people, but very active anti-Semitic National Union. It was that organization which fermented actually the only anti-Semitic riots in Greek history, the Campbell riots in 1931, on the very slightest of pretexts, which having to do with the fact that Jewish athletes in a Bulgarian political event were construed as anti-Greek. So it was a truly nothing event, but there you are. So this organization was banned in 1936, and it was resurrected under the Nazis, and then was relevant in the destruction of the cemetery in 1941. So all of this nationalist history and this rise of fascist anti-Semitic movements made themselves felt in the cemetery. The seeming imperatives of creating very rapidly a new national culture, given moral energy by national and local proponents of a thoroughly re-Christianized new counties. That is to say, Orthodox Greece now has taken over this land that had been claimed by Muslims and Jews for the last 4 millennia, contributed critically to the destruction of the cemetery. And then the coming to power of a fascist collaborationist government sealed its fate. But this doesn't really explain its erasure from memory in the decades after liberation. By 1945, the land was no longer at issue. The tiny Jewish community that gathered in Thessaloniki after the war, roughly 2,000 people, didn't reclaim the property for burial, didn't fight over memorial space, and the Greeks had no interest in it either. That is to say, the Aristotle University only very slowly covered every square meter of what had been the cemetery, and as I say, leaving no signs of its relationship to the dead underfoot for more than 7 decades. So nowhere else, in no other great city, did the imperatives of modernity and nation building telescope merge so decisively with the crisis of occupation and genocide and the erasure of memory. Nowhere else were both the community of the living and the community of the dead more sundered. It's a story, I think, unique in Europe. Elsewhere, the reshaping of the social imaginary in the wake of the Holocaust has entailed the recovery of Jewish places as a reminder of a community that had once stood in its midst. And discussed in the book, people bring ashes from places in concentration camps and rebury them in Père Lachaise and other great cemeteries of Europe. And as I said, these cemetery sites also survive. In many places, there was also, this really interests me, a repatriation of the names of the dead where the bodies were missing, names in place of the dead. One thinks then of the list of Holocaust dead in European cities and the names of murdered family members inscribed on tombstones of relatives who died more peacefully. So when you go to Jewish cemeteries in Europe, you'll find not only the names of the dead who were buried there, but the names of relatives who were killed in the Holocaust as a symbolic, as a place of the dead who have no place. But here, on the site of the Athens Aristotle University campus, we encounter a strange and inverted phenomena, a vast terrain of bodies that no longer have names, or any other sign that they existed. This might seem as a synecdoche for something larger in modern Greek history, a history that seems to right itself against an absence, an almost a half-millennial gap between the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the birth of a nation. It's part of a larger history of forgetting, a history impoverished by lacunae that is, in fact, not really lacunae at all. For the Jewish community, the incorporation of the story of its magnificent cemetery, as I say, the largest in Europe, into the public history of modern Greece, would allow it to mourn, more specifically, for its eradication. More importantly, it would also allow Greeks in Thessaloniki to remember the community that had lived in its midst for centuries, or in whose midst it had lived, to be more accurate. To remember a people for existing and prospering, not just for ceasing to exist through a genocide completed by the enemy in a matter of months. It would allow what happened in December 1942 to become part of a Greek and not only a German story. And there I would have ended. Sorry, John. There I would have ended until now. Look at the very first picture. Yeah. So this issue of that allow what happened in December 6, 1942 to become part of Greek, not just only a German story. Last month, the monument was desecrated. Pierced by members of the Golden Dawn. And it says that a Greek, particularly Christ triumphs. So my story is not over. Thank you.
I've never heard a lecture end with "my story is not over," but that's perfect.
Well, it's not over.
No, it's not. Our questions are awaiting you as well. So there is a tradition, as you may know, that at Nanovic we take questions first from students. I'm going to try to get a student. You can just pretend to be a student, but someone's got to raise his or her hand. And we'll get
We know you're faking it.
We're all students in life and some larger sense. I don't want to be the first to ask this question, but I will if I have to.
You know, give it a little longer.
Yes, that's right.
Wait a minute.
This is what you do in seminar?
That's what you do in seminar. I was told when I first started teaching by an older colleague that you just, it seems like forever, but just wait a minute.
All right. It They are.
And while we're waiting, just remember there's books for sale outside.
But don't go out there yet.
The shameless commerce division.
All right. Yeah, good. Very good.
Yeah, how are you?
How
You'd
did,
always break, you'd always break.
how did, oh, sorry. How did you first find out about the cemetery?
Well, I don't know if we were at the beginning. I said we got this little mimeograph. It's a quote everyone knew about it. In other words, we got this little handbook. I mean, sure, not an official, Lonely Planet guide. It was a little, the Sephardi community, these were Spanish-speaking Jews. Many of them went to Los Angeles, some went to New York, and my mother-in-law is a member of this community, so she belonged to these tribes. Some of them lived in Ladino, which is medieval Spanish, and some were in English. We got it. I can't remember which one this was written in. But in any case, we got this little book, and we landed, as I said at the beginning of the talk, we landed there, we got to our hotel, we're so tired. Carlos says, let's look at what my mom gave me. We looked at what her mom gave me, and it says, the Aristotle University is built the largest Jewish cemetery in Europe. And the next day, we couldn't find anything there. And as I gave the talk, and these colleagues said, really? But then when you actually wanted to find out about it, as I said, it's not, we did a lot of research in German sources and tried to follow up with what Bolo and these other people said was true. And, there's a survey of Jewish cemeteries in Eastern Europe. And, we did a lot of more research. But basically, you can read in Molo and in Damas in French essentially what happened. So we discovered it just by, it was known by people, but people wouldn't talk about it. There was no sign of this in the Jewish Museum at Thessaloniki. There was no discussion of the subject. It was one of these things in which people, it just wasn't, look, the issue, we're interested in the subject of what gets remembered and not. The erasure of memory is a huge topic. I just wrote a piece on the lynching museum in Montgomery, Alabama. The fact that, we're talking about 150 people being killed in one day in a labor dispute in places that you guys have never heard of. If I'd asked how many people here know about Elaine, Arkansas, I would probably guess.
My wife's from Arkansas.
This is not common knowledge, and these things are vastly more people getting killed than in the history of pogrom, or than in Kristallnacht, or than in the Great American Labor Strikes, and it's just erased. And it's not like we didn't know about it, it's in the bloody newspapers. So it's one of these weird stories in which people, for whatever reason, in this secular community, the Greek community, educated Greek community, and the Jewish community simply couldn't assimilate this story. And insofar as they could assimilate it, it was a Holocaust story. And it just wasn't. It just literally wasn't. The Germans didn't do it, and this is not their MO. So we started by we tried to figure out why is it that we had to learn about this from a little semi-mimeographed handbook. That was,
Thanks for your talk. One of the most surprising things that I learned was how the Germans, I don't want to say honored, but at least preserved all of these Jewish sites. And that strikes me as counterintuitive. And can you talk a little bit about how you interpret this surprise? After all, if they're going to destroy a people, it would kind of make sense to destroy their memory as well, but they don't do that. Do you have any explanation for that?
My sense is that they destroyed synagogues, but they also preserved Torah scrolls and other kinds of material for what they hoped would then be museums of a vanished people. So it was some version of, in some sense, they're sort of proud of the fact that they've cleared out living Jews in these places.
Right, but they've also desecrated those very rules as well.
Eventually, the synagogues, but they did desecrate many cemeteries. It just wasn't. They desecrated Christian cemeteries. In other words, we had to have a pond for fire prevention near something. They would clear graves. They cleared Christian graves. But it was instrumental. It was a.
Isn't it because, though, that the Jewish cemeteries were not centrally located like they were in Thessaloniki? And, they became central sometimes, like in Berlin, when you got to Princeton, the city grew around it.
Well, but, Oranienberg was there still Jewish graves there? No one, was bombing there, but Moses Mendelssohn graves are still there. In other words, Frankfurter Stadt's still there, and, in other words, the Strasse is, the other big German cemetery in Berlin, Jewish cemetery. Well, here's another example that's where it's central. In Breslau, in Wrocław, the only cemetery, actually German cemetery that remains of this, which was a German city, is a Jewish cemetery. And it's right in the middle of the city. So when the Poles destroyed everything German, after the war, the Poles destroyed everything German except this Jewish cemetery, which is now a national landmark, and it's quite beautiful and preserved.
Except you also see in the east streets that were paved with Jewish gravestones.
Well, not, I mean, as I said, there's one big example of that, and that's in Schindler's List, where they do.
I've seen it personally, but not that.
But I mean, this is not a, I mean, I could give you statistics, I went and counted these places. Many of them were destroyed after the war by the various communist regimes, people shopping centers there. I mean, there's no question. But as I said, destroying cemeteries is different than what I take to be iconoclasm. And what's interesting is, as I say, the murdering Jews was part of the story. The iconoclastic, destroying, and murdering where living Jews were, like destroying stores, is part of the story. Destroying that Jews had been there seems to be not of interest. In fact, on the contrary, this is sort of a matter of pride of saying we have rid the people of this, who are now still, where we have, once they were thick on the land, and now they're gone. I think that, but it's hard to argue for a negative, it just didn't happen. That's what I'm, that's.
That you just alluded makes sense. That is to say, by keeping these sites, they remind everyone of what they've done.
Right.
But that doesn't fit with some of the conversations we've heard about, let's make sure that nobody hears about the Holocaust.
Well, they murdered people, but the fact, I mean, the fact that these were cemeteries, and they just, well, look, it's also disorderly. The Nazis were, by and large, except for Kristallnacht, they were not into pogroms. They were into murdering Jews systematically. I mean,
Except that there was no monolithic policy, it was a chaos, right?
Sorry?
There was a chaotic experience, it wasn't a monolithic policy.
No, but there was an effort, I followed this now a little bit with this lynching story, and every time there was something in the American press about how terrible the Nazis were in the 30s, they would talk about lynchings in America, and the story was always, we get it with racial policy, that's fine, but why do the Americans do this so unsystematically? And why is the state not involved in this version? Of solving the racial issue. So I mean, it's my sense of this is, it's hard to talk about a negative. There just is no policy on the subject. I mean, as I say, they don't, I'm really interested in, not only did the Germans not do it, but they didn't do it other places. This is the only major destruction. I mean, we have a list we can talk about cemeteries where they took stones, that they did in Frankfurt. It's not, they never did it. But in none of the symbolically large places where you think in the middle of Berlin, you destroy a Jewish cemetery. Or Munich Jewish cemeteries in fine shape. So that's what interested me. They just didn't, but I haven't found a record where they say why they didn't do it. I'm just assuming they didn't do it because it proves that they killed the living. But it's speculative. As far as I can tell, and I've talked to experts on, Holocaust in Germany and stuff in this period, and no one has it's not a record that says let's not destroy Jewish cemeteries. That's all I can do. A better answer to this.
Well, I think there's a matrix of possibilities, and there were different motivations at different times. And I think you're right. In Prague, for example, they wanted to make a museum of the absence, a museum of death of Jews, and so that was retained. In other places, they were quite willing to destroy it. One thing that we're lacking is consistency with Nazi policy.
Right.
One thing students want again and again is one simple answer as to what did they always do. Well, they were never consistent.
Right.
So we also got postcards from the killing fields bragging about it, at the very same time when one could say other officers were trying to keep it quiet.
Right. But as I say, when you just try, I did a lot of little towns in Germany, and like where my family was, Holzminden an der Weser, the town in northern Germany, Nazi, really Nazi part of Germany, Nazi, northern Germany, Protestant, and the Jewish cemetery is fine. In other words, it didn't seem to be something that anyone, it just wasn't part of the shtick. Now, as I say, especially in the East, and in certain particular cases, like Schindler's List is about a guy who takes the very social cemetery and paves the road to the concentration camp with him. But that's one guy. But this is not a general MO. That's all I meant. And why?
We partially answered it, but I was wondering how you can be confident that this wasn't something that happened if part of the narrative is that we've erased the memory of it, right? So perhaps it did happen, but we're just not aware of it precisely because it was a successful erasure of memory. Do you see what I'm saying? So I understand that there aren't records from the Nazis that they destroyed cemeteries and that they had designs to do so in a systematic way, but it just seems possible that other cemeteries were destroyed and those communities,
Well,
I don't know, didn't have a pamphlet that contradicted
It's
local.
possible that I mean, look, I didn't survey every cemetery, and the surveys of Jewish cemeteries, someone did a survey of all Jewish cemeteries in Europe. And so it's not a perfect survey, and I'm sure there's some cemeteries which were destroyed that people didn't notice, or some that are lost in the forests of Ukraine or wherever. But you know, we look at every major city, and they're there. And this erasure is, we have photographs of doing it. It's not, I mean, I showed you just a few pictures. We have guys breaking up the stones. You know, we have the city council's orders to do it. It's not like this is, who'd have thunk it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you know, that's what, I mean, the thing is, you walk there now, and it looks like this campus. I mean, literally, this different architecture, you know, but it just looks like a campus. And somebody told you, listen, this is actually buried on 500,000 bodies. You'd be sort of surprised. I mean,
Thanks a lot for the talk. So I'm interested in how memory is constructed and how it develops, how this construction develops over time.
Right.
So could you say a bit more about attitudes among the Jewish community to the cemetery over, let's say, the 40s to 60s?
It's really an interesting question. I can say relatively little. First of all, well, they didn't speak of it. So the Jewish Museum in Thessaloniki didn't raise the question, except in the most oblique way. So there's some stones in the American School in Athens, which when we were there, a few of those had been moved to the museum, and this was part of the destruction of the cemetery. Some people say there was some sort of chicanery about who got compensation for the land, but that's, so that might be a part of the story. But we don't speak Greek, and so, that would be a real other project to figure out what happened in this sort of local and not presumably very edifying politics of German compensation. So my sense is that the community was sort of lying low and quiet in the face of what they took, and certainly under the dictators, under the military regime. We're just quiescent.
So there was no like tradition or diaries or even newspaper articles of like.
Well, as I say, there's certainly diaries. I got this guy. I've cited a few of these people, and this rabbi kept a detailed account of this. So sure, people knew about it. But as I say, the Jewish community in Thessaloniki, when we first published this, asked us for copies of this in English and some in Greek, because it seems sort of news to them. So, as I say, I don't know enough about why they're not interested in this story, and it was actually brought out less by the Jewish community than by this progressive mayor, who, for his point, my sense of his point of view was thought this was anti-right. I mean, he took this as a kind of progressive move to combat the Christian far-right in Greece as part of his story. But it's a really interesting question. No one has really worked on that part of the story. There is a new book on the Thessaloniki Jewish community, but it doesn't really go into this later story, the forgetting story.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah, sorry.
Two.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk. I'm really interested in the disarticulation of the cemetery itself from a material standpoint.
Right.
And in a strange way, heartened by the sense that there's a reformation in terms of those materials, those building blocks, those stones, that long list that you articulated, where they go.
Right.
And in some ways, the spread of those memories, at least in the material sense, to other places. Can you tell a little more in terms of, I'm interested in the visibility of that, the extent to which that is something that is visible within the urban landscape, or if it's something that is just hidden between plaster and sort of
In between, I mean, the ones that said, the church of St. Demetrius, for example, you can still see them there. I assume, I didn't check on the Wehrmacht swimming pool, I assume it's gone. You can still go to the American School and find stones. The Jewish Museum has collected some more. 2 of the stones in this memorial are genuine, 2 are replicas. But you don't see them I mean, they're where they are when you're the National Theater. I mean, you can still see the remnants of them. You don't want to tore them up. But there's been no reassemblage of these stones. And as I say, even right now, this is really controversial. To speak of a Jewish presence in Thessaloniki is to invite the kind of desecration of this site that you saw. This is not yesterday's politics.
We're going to go here first and we'll go back over here. Yes.
So, Mr. Gorbachev, as you said, the past is not over and history is not.
Say it again?
The past is not over, history is not finished.
Yeah.
So, I was wondering, what's your relation as a historian with the past, which it's personal, it's has morals, it has political issues. How do you relate with these complex themes?
How do I relate to it?
Yes, with the past.
Well, look, I mean, boy, that's a big question. I mean, in some sense, look, just, you know, I mean, I'm not Greek, but if I were, let me give you a story. My best friend is the nephew of this man, Yosef Nehama. He's a very distinguished philosopher at Princeton, and he was just elected to the Greek Academy, which is a great honor. And there's now a campaign to keep his election from actually being announced. He's been called by the President of the Republic. Congratulating him. But it's not official, and there's no version of it. It's because his name is Nehama. And the argument is he's not really Greek. He's Jewish. So, you know, in my life, there's a guy who's, and it's a very public campaign to keep him, because it's a big deal with the Greek Academy. So there, you'd like the story to be, well, in point of fact, the Jews have been crucial to the history of Greece, and there were a lot of them, right? And so it's a little bit like all these versions of memory. In other words, it's hard to say what, and that's why I thought about these lynching museums. It's hard to know exactly what it's going to do, but the fact that these guys are presenting the story of American history where there's a continuity between slavery and the imprisonment of black people and the current incarceration crisis, and lynching is part of the story, is reserved for the regime of slavery. It seems not inconsequential in thinking about American race. So it's, I mean, it's hard, each of us, what does remembering actually do? You know, one would have to sort of specify in particular cases. But it seems to me forgetting also has real dangers. And as I say, you can point to specific cases, and one just happened very intimately in my life. They're very painful. It's the newspapers. It's not like it's obscure. There's no hiding this.
Good, let's go.
Right.
I was just wondering that when you brought attention to this issue that everyone had kind of sort of put out of their minds, and you pointed out that this was mostly perpetrated by the Greeks of Thessaloniki, and it wasn't entirely the fault of.
Was it all the fault of the Germans?
It wasn't at all the fault of the German occupation.
Right.
Even though it was a very convenient way to shift blame. Can you talk a little bit about, did you encounter any resistance in these communities to the truth?
Well, I haven't encountered, I mean, look, I wasn't there doing it. We were constantly, we know that the current mayor read our article, so that it had some influence on people. But look, it's still an amazing question. The signage of this still denies it, gets it wrong. I mean, the Germans just didn't do it. I mean, the occupation made it possible, but the Germans didn't do it. The Germans didn't desecrate the site. The Greeks desecrated. Just that's not an interpretation. I mean, to try to suggest to you that's a fact. And now the Germans, as I said, made it possible in the ways I described. This fascist regime wouldn't have come into power if it hadn't been for the German occupation. So it's not, they're not inconsequential. But they still don't want to, and why? I don't know enough about the local politics, but I do know that the progressive community would like to change this. So a colleague of mine who works on shared sacred sites in that part of the world had an exhibit there, which sort of suggested Karen Bark used to teach at Columbia and I teach at Berkeley. And she has a project that looks around the Middle East at places that Islam and Jews and Christians share. And they had an exhibit in Thessaloniki, and that too was desecrated. Posters. So there's a real resistance on the right to that this is the nation is not made up of one people, and we just have to look at lots of places, Hungary, possibly Poland. There are experts in this room about these sort of issues, but the question who belongs to the nation is not the bad question. So I think it's that sort of version. It's just no, they're not part of it. Not Muslims are, neither are Jews.
Was there one?
Really quick follow-up question. On that then, do you think that a lot of this resistance is geared towards the people want to forget again, or geared more towards the idea that this true history is misinterpreted?
Well, I just don't want to, I don't want to work at forgetting. It's one of these, the history doesn't fit into a story that you want to tell. I mean, people tell stories, and history is made up by people in the present. But this is what I'm trying to suggest to you, that the thing to be interpreted is not the event. There's no question who did it. What's to be interpreted is the history of the misinterpretation, willful or not. And I don't know enough to tell you whether the misinterpretation. My guess is probably like most misinterpretations, not noticing and not noticing you're not noticing. Would be my if I look at non-interpret, that would be my sense.
Let's take one final question.
I've got a question.
We talked about that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim.
Go ahead, Jim.
No.
I had a question about the signage.
About what?
About the signs specifically,
Yeah.
And which were presumably a kind of a progressive gesture in the midst of this kind of educated and cosmopolitan community. How did they get the history so wrong? Have you looked into how the history was distorted?
Yes, I do know. This guy, Nar, who's a history of the Sephardic community there, spoke to the mayor's office and said, so why don't you actually say the Greeks did it? And the mayor's answered, the Devin Nar teaches at Washington, and he said, look, you're a historian and you deal with truth. I'm a politician, I deal with the possible. So there's a monument there that it doesn't quite get the truth.
Good. So we're going to move into the ceremonial part of the afternoon. But not before, I want to recognize Christian. Christian, would you stand up? Yes, we should applaud. You don't know why you're applauding, but go ahead. It's a very involved process. I'm actually learning it myself, and I'm referring to recruiting the books and parceling them out. And it's a year-long process, and you led it, and we're very grateful to you. And all of this happened under the supervision of Jim, who's with us in the second round, so we're grateful to you as well.
Called me with the good news.
He called you with the good news. Very good. So that's all to be good. If I had more time to ask you, and I will tonight, I would have asked, is there an analogy to the Jan Groth story about kind of local collaborators? And, when Nazis come in as triggers, do they release energy such as in Lithuania and elsewhere? And is that the kind of model of thinking? But I will take that later, just to give you a little tease. I do want to say one thing. I guess I will begin one thing. You saw today the way Tom Laqueur is moving into the audience, addressing people personally, talking about his family and his wife. All of this is to be had in the book. There's memoir here. The style of writing is like reading The New Yorker. So buy it, cozy up to the fireplace, and really open it, and you won't be able to put it down. You can read in it, you can pick and choose, but it's just a really pleasurable and enlightening read. So do that. And now, camera's ready. Professor Laqueur, I am, on behalf of the Nanovic Institute, very proud to present you with the Laura Shannon Prize. Congratulations.